Welcome back once again to Church of the Rock's Expedited Audio Training. In session 6 we started mixing and we did a hands-on training session, and I hope that gave you a taste for mixing. And now we're going to dive deep into equalization. I need to really start off with this, just don't be afraid of EQ. At its very basics, it's actually a very simple tool. You're just turning up or down certain frequencies in a sound instead of turning up or down the entire sound. And then to figure out where to start, you need to ask yourself kind of simple questions. What does this sound need? Does it need more clarity, less rumble, more body, less sharpness? And even though it's relatively simple to start with, it can be a tool that you can master over time. And then to get to that mastery, you need to just try things out, work in your mixes, change your EQ, and see how it sounds. So I hope you enjoy the video, and please complete all the questions when you are done. And I think it's going to be a very helpful session. God bless. Today we're going to talk all about EQ. Equalization is what EQ stands for, and EQ is an important tool to use for any audio tech. This is something you can develop a lifelong skill that you can use in lots of different applications for any kind of sound application, and it's something where you can get better and better at this as time goes on. Some people dial this into really minute amounts, but to get a basic understanding of it is fairly easy to start with, and that's hopefully what we're going to get to today. We've covered EQ briefly in some previous sessions. Today we want to dive in a little deeper, talk a bit about a few more specifics, and help you get to the place where you'll feel a lot more comfortable if you ever need to EQ a sound source. The first thing I want to re-emphasize, as I stated in previous sessions, is that with EQ, you're never just twiddling knobs and hopefully it magically sounds better. You always want to have a goal in mind. You always want to be able to think to yourself, what am I trying to improve? Like, why am I going for an EQ control? And it might be something like, I need more clarity out of this vocal. Now that's a good target, not just, well, I hope it sounds better. So you always want to have a very thoughtful target of why you're reaching for an EQ knob, what you're trying to change, and what you think it'll improve in the mix. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and that's an important thing to have as something that will guide everything you do when you make your decision making. So I'm just going to do a very, very quick recap of EQ. If you haven't been a part of the previous sessions, look back to sessions 1 and 2, and those will help you get a better understanding of these major concepts about EQ. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper. So the main thing is that there's two main types of EQ. There is a graphic EQ, in which there is a bunch of fixed points of frequencies that have fixed amounts of change, and you can't change which frequency they are. They are all going to be at whatever frequency they are set at, and you can either cut or boost those frequencies, and that's the overall control. Graphic EQs are almost never used on individual sound sources. Sometimes they are, but often they are just used on setting up sound systems, etc. The more common EQ you're going to use is called parametric EQ. Now usually there's a lot fewer bands, but you have much more control over each one. And in parametric EQ, there's 4 main shapes. The first is a filter, and this one says high pass filter here. If I press that button and turn this knob, you'll see that it cuts off all the low frequencies. So high pass filter allows all the highs to pass, but doesn't allow any of the lows to pass. That's a filter. A shelf is basically, if you ever have a bass knob on your car stereo, that's what a shelf is. It basically turns the whole low section up or down by the same amount, roughly. There's a bit more complicated explanation than that, but roughly the whole low frequency range is going to go up or down. And you can choose how low or how high. And there's also a shelf on the highs as well to turn the whole high frequencies up or down by the same amount. And then there is a bell curve, which is the most common. Basically, one frequency is boosted with a certain number of frequencies surrounding it. So you're affecting either a smaller or larger area if you affect the bandwidth. Those are the 3 main controls with any kind of parametric EQ. You have a gain, which is how much you're boosting or cutting. A frequency, which is how low or how high a frequency you're affecting. And then a width, which is how many other frequencies you're affecting with it, how narrow or how wide it is. The main 3 things that you use EQ for is obviously tone control, so affecting the entire sound of any kind of sound source that comes in. Separation of similar sounds, so when you have 2 things that have a very similar sound, you can use EQ to try to have some differentiation between the 2. For example, let's say 2 electric guitars. or let's say a bass guitar and a kick drum. And a third thing is there's also, of course, maybe more than 3 things you can use EQ for. But the third main thing is for feedback control. So when you've set up your whole sound system correctly, everything is plugged in and being operated in its correct manner, and you still have feedback, then you can go to EQ to also help you to reduce some of that feedback as well. So that's a very, very, very quick recap. Again, if you want more information, you can go back to session 1 and 2. But for now, we're going to keep building on, adding more to what we've learned. All right, so now I want to talk to you about boost and sweep. This is a technique where we can take a frequency and exaggerate it so we can find it more easily. So how we do that is we would take our gain knob, we would boost up a frequency, then we would use our frequency knob and we would sweep it left and right, which means lower and higher frequencies, until we would find the problem area. And then you could use the Q knob to make it a bit narrower at first so that you have a bit more smaller range to sweep around, and then you might widen that out when you're done. So basically what you're doing is you're trying to find a problem frequency, so you would boost it and move it till it sounds its absolute worst. And then what you would do is you would apply a cut to that frequency and see if it fixes your problem. So I have a vocal which I know sounds a bit muffly, doesn't sound as clear as I would like it. And just from a little bit of experience, you get to learn that quite often that doesn't mean you need to boost necessarily your high frequencies. Sometimes it does. Often that means you need to cut something in the low mid frequencies. So I think that's going to be the problem with this vocal. And we're going to demonstrate that now. I'm going to play it for you first without much EQ on it. And then I'm going to do the boost and sweep to show you the technique to how to find the problem frequency. So here we go. Here's the vocal.
You are my freedom. We lift you higher, your love.
So I think you'll notice that sounds a little bit muffled, doesn't sound quite as clear as it should. And so we're going to try to find those low frequencies that are getting in the way, those low mids. So I'm going to now put the sound back up.
Take your place.
I'm going to take the low mid knobs, take the gain knob and boost it up significantly.
Your love has set us free.
And it should start sounding worse, which it does. Then I'm going to move it left and right till it sounds its absolute worst. Let me find a spot where
yeah. You are my freedom. We lift you higher, your love.
So right there sounds the absolute worst.
Never ending. You are alive in us. Nothing.
And now you see, even with a fairly small cut to that exact same area, that vocal sounds noticeably clearer and easier to define the pitch and just be able to hear it with more detail. So I think that was a really good way to show that you can boost something, move the frequency to find the worst frequency, and then you make a cut. And that should help you to identify stuff in the future. Next thing then I want to talk about is some common EQ you can use on different sources. I really want to emphasize again that there is no magic EQ. There's no settings that work perfectly on, let's say, every vocal every time, or every kick every time, or every bass every time. You want to be able to get confident enough in your own abilities, in your own ear, that you can go up to a mixing board and look at each source individually and try to find out exactly what EQ each source needs by itself. So you never want to rely on just information or knowledge strictly on like, this is what I do with my kick drums. What you want to do is you want to rely on listening for it, using this boost and sweep, identifying each source for what it could need or what it might not need, and then being able to dial it in specifically. With that all said though, there is some certain frequency ranges that are more commonly going to help on certain sources, and that's because if you remember back from the session we did where we went through each individual instrument talking about the sounds that are a part of those sounds and the purposes of each instrument, then these EQ that we're going to do now goes along with that. Because there's certain things you're expecting to hear in a kick drum, for example, so then there's certain frequencies that are going to boost the things you're expecting to hear. And that's just because that's what's part of the sound, so you're just enhancing what's already there naturally. So again, there's certain ranges that are going to work fairly reasonably, but each individual instrument should be looked at each individual time. With that said though, let's talk about some of those things that are the same. First thing is that when I'm doing a mix, on basically every single instrument except for the kick drum and the bass, I put in that high pass filter. I want to get rid of all of the very, very low frequencies because the only two things in my mix that really contain much low-end information are the kick drum and the bass. Sometimes there's a floor tom, Or if it's a song that's almost just piano, the low notes of a piano do occupy those very low frequencies, but for most of the time, you don't want the piano or the floor tom rumbling overly much. So basically on every single instrument except for the kick and the bass, I'll put in a high pass filter. The main reason why is that you're not losing any information that's valuable because they don't contain all that low information anyway. But what you will do is get rid of any kind of rumble. If it's a mic, for example, and you tap on it or bang on it, you'll reduce that sound. If all of a sudden there's an airplane that goes by, it's not going to pick up the very low frequencies. All those kinds of things, HVAC systems, even when someone has they breathe into the mic too much to get the pua, pee, pa, the plosives, those won't rumble as bad through your subs. So basically on everything, once again, except for your kick and your bass, you want a high pass filter. But then I want to go through the individual instruments. So let's go through the kick drum. So basically, if you remember from the previous session, kick drum has a big boom sound and it has a beater sound. And so you're going to use your EQ to enhance those things. So I'm going to play a kick drum here. So this already has quite a bit of EQ on it. And if you take a look at the EQ, there's a low boost, a low mid cut, and a high mid boost. And that basically enhances what's already going on. That enhances what's going on with the kick drum. And so the low boost enhances the big thump that comes out of a kick drum. The low mid cut gets rid of some of the mid-ranginess, and the high mid boost enhances the beater. So I'm just going to show that to you and see when you take it out what difference it makes. So I'm going to play this here again. Starting with the low, if I remove this low boost that we have, you notice how it gets much thinner and weaker sounding. You don't hear the body of that kick near as much. If I even take it further, notice how it sounds really kind of paper thin, and you hear none of that, the main body you're going for. If I bring that back up, you hear that body. So this is going to be in the very low frequencies, and again, for each individual kick, you might be slightly different, each individual room, how it's set up. And so it could be anywhere from like 80 hertz down to 50 hertz, sometimes even a bit past that range. And again, you can use your boost and sweep to try to find the exact kind of right frequency. And I think in this room, for this kick, it's probably right around there. Going to the high mid, that's where you hear the beater sound. So if I enhance that, you hear more of that attack of the beater sound. But if I get rid of it, now you see how dull sounding that kick is. There's no definition to it. All you hear is a kind of. And so that's a very important part of the sound. And again, this is somewhere in the high mid range. This can be a pretty widely ranging depending on which type of kick it is. So if I boost it, it's a little bit less clear there. If I go too far, it's, instead of sounding more clear, it starts to sound a bit harsh or artificial. So somewhere in this range where you're boosting the clarity without it starting to sound overly affected. The low mid is where we have a big cut, because there's this thing that happens with kick drums where it gets this unwanted frequency. I'm not sure if I'd call that boxiness or stuffiness. Almost sounds like a quack, 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 quack. And this is almost every single kick drum has something in this. So by trying to make it sound the worst possible, probably right around there, and you pull some of that out. Also, you notice it sounds much more smooth, it sounds more defined, and it sounds just like a better kick. So this ended up being around 450 hertz. That can be anywhere from 400 to 600, depends on which kick, or even past those ranges as well. So that is how I would EQ a kick drum. A snare is similar but different in that there's body and a crack sound to a snare drum. And so again, there's quite often two main parts you might want to EQ to enhance the naturally occurring frequency range of that instrument. And it's always going to be a little bit higher than a kick drum because it's a smaller drum. And you might want more snap than you get instead of a beater attack. So I'm going to go ahead and play this back, the snare. And then I'm going to show you some of those EQ things. You notice again that there is a high-pass filter in rolling off the very lows. And I'm going to enhance some other things to show you what it sounds like. So here's going to be the snare. So if I enhance the low, it's going to bring out more body. Of course, that's too much and starts to sound a bit stuffy if you add too much in. But if you take it out, notice how weak and thin that sounds. It's really missing the fundamental part of its own sound. So a little boost in this area can quite often add a much more body. So anywhere in that there's a low range, kind of 100 to 300, depends on again, with the snare drum. Then the next thing that's going to be enhanced is that kind of snap sound. This one has quite a bit naturally occurring, so it doesn't need much of a boost. But if I boost the high mid, it brings out the attack of the stick and the kind of snap sound. But if you have too much, it starts to sound artificial and forced and sharp. But again, if I take it out, it just really sounds dull and you can't really hear anything you need to hear out of it. So this one ends up somewhere in this general range. Small boost sounds really good on the snare. For a hi-hat, it depends now if you have an acoustic hi-hat or one that's electronically created. Sometimes if you're using an electronically created one, they might already have EQ on them, those kinds of things. On an acoustic one, sometimes the actual opening and closing has its own kind of a sound, but the main thing with a hi-hat is it's gonna be mostly high frequencies being a cymbal. But some of them, again, if they open and close, they have a little bit of a low range to them. And so for the most part, you just need to roll off the low end and don't do much else with them. But let me just show you what we have on ours, and you can show you what it can enhance or detract from it. So let me play that here. There we go. It'll come in just 1 second. Yep, there we go. Okay, so with the hi-hat, there's actually a little bit, you can hear a little bit of low frequency stuff from the opening and closing, but it's mostly high frequencies. If I boost the high mids, see, it brings out a lot of that clarity to the point of being way too much. But if you would take it out too much, it would lose all its definition. So sometimes even just flats or just a small boost will help. If you really wanted to boost that opening and closing, you could try a low mid boost. For the most part, that's not adding a lot that's desirable. So in this case, I run almost a flat EQ. It doesn't need much enhancing what comes naturally, but these are, again, electronically generated. If you had an acoustic drum kit, the way your mic was positioning, you might need to enhance different parts. So again, you want to listen for it, but the main thing you want out of your hi-hat is the clarity. You want it to sound clear so everyone can hear it without sounding sharp. And if there is a nice natural sounding of opening and closing that's got a little bit of low end in it, you might need to enhance that. But quite often what you pick up naturally will be just fine. The same thing will be the case with the ride cymbal. It's very, very similar that way. The toms are only used usually as accents in a song. And when they do come in, you want them to sound full and clear. They don't really have as much of that whole two parts to the sound the way a snare does, where there's a big body sound and a snap sound. They mostly just have that body sound like that. And there's some clarity to them, so if you had no clarity at all, that wouldn't work. So let's just look at the EQ we have on these. I have a similar but lesser EQ, where I have a little bit of a low boost to catch that body, and a little bit of a higher mid just to make sure the clarity of the sticks kind of hitting the skins. And those can be exaggerated a bit if you wanted to really enhance those. But for the most part, again, you don't need a ton of EQ on this. And to me, that sounds pretty good. So I think that's going to be a good way to talk about toms. That would be a good sound. Next thing I want to talk about is overheads. Basically, on an acoustic drum kit, you have mics that are literally over the drummer's head. That's why they were called overheads. And what they usually pick up the most is cymbals. They pick up a bit of the drum kit as well, so they'll pick up basically all the parts of the drum kit. And so the main thing you're focusing on there is making sure the cymbals will sound good. And again, cymbals have mostly high frequency information. They don't contain much low end whatsoever. So for the most part, you just need that high pass filter to roll off all the low end and make sure that the clarity comes through. You might not need to boost it or enhance it, but if you do, it might make it sound more sharp. Take it out, it'll sound a little bit less. And let's just listen to that for now. So like I said, it's picking up the ambience of the drum kit, and you hear the cymbals the most prominently. I've rolled off much of the low end because I don't want that, if there is any kick that comes through that ambience, I don't want it to interfere with the clarity of the kick drum. And in this case, my cymbals were almost too sharp sounding, so I pulled a little bit of the high frequencies out of it. But I'm going to exaggerate it so you want it to hear it sounds like when there's too much of that. So again, with too much high frequency, it just gets a bit too sharp sounding, almost sounds a bit thinner and lighter sounding. It's been overly exaggerated, and so that's not going to sound the best. Next thing I want to talk about is the bass guitar. Now, bass guitar is really important to get right. It goes along quite often with the kick, and it provides the body of your whole sound. And it again has, in some ways, a wider variety than some of the instruments might, in that certain bass guitars will have different strings, they'll have different pickup settings, they'll have different DI settings. Some people like to have a bit of a distorted sound. But for the most part from a bass, there's different styles of what people might want from them. So at Church of the Rock, we like to have clarity from the bass, so you hear both the low end and the definition of notes and some clarity. In some mixes or in certain recordings or live settings, they might have just the low frequency, so there's no clarity whatsoever. That's a stylistic choice. But for the most part, we're looking for both body and clarity in our bass guitars. So this song is a dancier song. They actually have a little bit of a distortion on it. That's going to affect the way it sounds a bit. And so let's listen to that bass guitar. So like I said, it's almost a little bit grimy sounding. It's got a little bit of a distortion on it. I'm going to add a little bit of a low mid to it to add to more of the body. You see that here. And then the high mid helps with some clarity and definition. So I'm going to exaggerate those things so you hear how those sound. So with too much, it becomes overwhelming and kind of sloppy sounding. But again, thinned out, and it's no longer a bass guitar, it's something else, because that's what you need from a bass. You need this low end. The high mid is what's showing the clarity and that kind of string noise. Too much, obviously, you get all this string noise and it sounds offensive. But then too little, and all you get is that low frequency. So for us, we want that clarity, so we want to have some of that in there. And then on each bass guitar, you're going to have to dial in how much of that and exactly which frequency. This one doesn't need much of a boost there at all, so I'm going to end up right there. So that sounds fairly decent to me. That bass is meant to sound a bit distorted and a bit grungy sounding. But another thing I want to talk about is its relationship to the kick drum. So the way that your bass guitar and your kick drum relate to each other is very important, because they can get in each other's way. They both produce a lot of low frequency information, and if they both have too much of that, you won't hear either as clearly. So quite often, one thing we do, I talked about how we use EQ to separate similar sounds. What we're going to do is we're actually going to take out the very low frequencies out of the bass guitar, and they're going to match what we boosted in the kick previously. So basically, the only thing that's going to occupy those very low frequencies, or more so, is going to be the kick drum, where the bass guitar is going to have a few less of those, but then they're going to occupy these just slightly higher low frequencies. And therefore, they're not getting in each other's way as much. You'll hear both more clearly, and there'll be more definition and distinction between your kick and your bass. So I'm going to, first of all, show you that cut on this bass, and then I'm going to play it with the kick so you can hear it, how they affect each other. So I'm going to play the bass. I'm going to take the low, and I'm going to boost it up. And it doesn't really add much usefulness. It just makes the heating system rattle. It adds actually less clarity for the most part. So if I take some of that out, it actually sounds a bit more manageable. And then if I add in the kick drum, you can hear them both fairly clearly off each other. But if I'd enhance this low on this bass, you hear that snap of the kick drum, but you don't hear the body of it because now they're getting in each other's way. So notice too that I actually have the exact same frequency cut out of the bass that I have boosted in the kick. They're both at exactly 63 hertz, and therefore you're the exact same boost that I needed on the kick. I'm now pulling out of my bass, and both are improving because of it. So it's really good to think about your relationship between your kick and your bass and get those EQs right. So that's one specific way you can use the EQ to separate out similar sounding instruments. Next thing I want to talk about is the synthesizer. So these sounds are quite often, again, coming out of something that's been sample-based, so a synthesizer quite often has been a well-recorded sound. And to begin with, it has its own EQ already for the most part. So what comes to you is already a fairly clean, good-sounding sound for the most part. So usually we won't need a ton of EQ, but some synth sounds, depending on which sound they're using, might radically change going from sound to sound. So if they're using a church organ sound, it's going to be very clear and kind of sharp sounding. If they're using what's supposed to be like a synth bass sound, it might have a lot of low end. And so you might need to EQ based on specific sounds being used from the synth. So in this song, it's kind of a dancey song, kind of a electronic music sound. And it needs to be clear and full, both without being too much low end. And that's basically what is already coming out of the synth, so it shouldn't need much EQ, but I'll show you what happens when we exaggerate certain areas. So this song is, again, really reliant on the synth. It's the main part of the song. So it sounds pretty good, and it might have it's fairly clear sounding, fairly full sounding. I don't hear any real problem frequencies with it. So basically I've rolled off some low end, and that would probably be good enough. But let's say you need it to be clear in the mix, you might try to take the high mid and boost it slightly. But you know if you take too much, it very quickly gets kind of thin sounding and a bit too sharp sounding. If you get rid of too much, you lose the clarity. If I take the low mids, for example, and boost them, there's nothing in there that really needs the boost there, but if you would cut it out, you lose some of the body again, you lose some of the definition of it. So for a synth, you're going to have to look at each one individually, each sound, and judge for yourself what may need to be EQ'd or not. You might not need any at all. It might come to you sounding exactly how it should, and that's always great. Less EQ is actually overall better. Not having to use as much is always going to make your whole mix sound better, but you got to use what you need to use, but without having to always exaggerate everything overly much. So next thing I want to talk about is piano. So pianos have the largest frequency range really out of almost any instrument you're going to see on your stage. They can go from very low notes to very high notes. And so you need to, again, determine what is being used on which song. If it's mostly just piano on that song, you might allow all the frequencies to come through well, so you hear the very lows and the very highs. But if a piano is being used in a full mix with lots of other instruments, there's the most common thing, you're actually going to reduce a fair bit of the lows and the low mids so that they don't interfere with other instruments. For example, your electric guitars, your acoustic guitars, your vocals, or even your bass guitars, because they can go down that low. So again, you need to know kind of which sound is being used for which song on a piano. And I guess, especially if it's an electric piano, they might even use like an organ sound. So that might be different yet, it might need different EQ requirements. So in this song, they're using kind of an organ sound. They're using it in kind of a lower mid-range of notes that they're playing in. It's meant to make the synth sound thicker and not really to be its own distinct part, but to add to the synth to make it sound like one big kind of a part. And so in that case, we might need to enhance the low mids a little bit and probably not need to enhance other stuff as much. So let's listen to how that sounds on its own first. It's maybe not an organ, that's more of an electric piano sound. So again, even with almost no EQ, that already sounds pretty good. If I wanted to enhance some of that low frequency range, I might add some of that in. In this case, actually all it does is make it sound more muffled. It doesn't add more body really, so I probably wouldn't do that. If you need a bit more clarity to come through a bit more, you could maybe add some of that, but again, too much is going to start to sound artificial and a bit fake and too sharp. You might have a little bit too much of this low mid thing, so you might make it sound the worst possible, again, and then take some of that out. Yeah, to me that makes a small improvement. So now we hear that mixed back in with the synth. So the two together really complement each other well. One's doing lower notes, one's doing higher notes, and they're kind of covering the whole range a bit better. And so you can use your EQ to enhance that as well. And so that's one way to use that as well. If you had, again, piano sound more so, sometimes you might need to boost some of the high mids in order to bring out some clarity so it comes through the mix a little better, and take out, again, some of that low and low mid so that also doesn't interfere with other instruments. In this case, with this electric piano sound, all it needed was a little bit of a cut to the low mid and a little bit of a boost to the high mid, and that sounded really good. For an acoustic guitar, there's lots of considerations because there's lots of different acoustic guitars. There's different brands, there's different strings, there's different sizes, there's different pickup shapes. So each acoustic is going to have to be evaluated individually. Some have too much low end in them, so they sound too big and they compete with the bass guitar. Some sound thin, some have really beautiful tone and clarity. So you have to look at each individual one by itself. So let's listen to what we have here. I'm not sure exactly what type of acoustic this was. Again, there's a lot of variety in the types of acoustics. And so let's listen to this one first. So to my ear, it doesn't have a lot of body to it, and it has a little bit, probably too much high mids or sharpness. It sort of sounds a bit harsh without a lot of body. So you might use your EQ to try to tone down some of the harshness and maybe try to bring in some of that body. So let's listen to that again. So I'm gonna try to find the most harsh spots. Probably somewhere around there. But you know what? Take out too much and you lose all of the clarity. So here's the smallest little cut. Now to try to give it some body, you might add some low mid. That's not bad. By also adding in some of that low end and giving it a bit more body, it also naturally does cause it to have a little bit less sharpness, and that actually helps it sound a little bit less harsh. In this case, that might sound a touch more muffly than you want it, so this sometimes might be a delicate balance. But in this case, for this guitar, I think a small boost in that high mid and a small cut a small boost in the low mid and a small cut in the high mid made a nice little difference. Sometimes you can only do so and so much. EQ can't fix very large problems, but sometimes you can really enhance or boost things that are already there and make them sound as best as they can be through your sound system. So again, look at each acoustic individually and evaluate each one personally. Same thing is applied to electric guitars. Again, huge range of guitar amps, electric guitar bodies, different strings, different effects. And also with electric guitars, you need to know what they're going for. So this is really good to have communication with your worship leader, with your band members. What is the guitar supposed to sound like? Because they can be really sharp sounding, and they're supposed to be really sharp sounding or have a lot of body. And so you really want to know what they're going for in that song, and then EQ accordingly, make it sound the way it should accordingly. So in this song, I know that they're using an electric guitar that's a Fender to a Fender amp. It's supposed to have clarity but some drive, and I think they accomplished that fairly well. Actually, as I listen to it, it's not as clear as it could be. It's actually a little bit muffled. So sometimes you take out a little low mid or add a little high mid will help that. That one's a little bit better. Let's go back to the top. That again didn't need a lot. That kind of part of that song, the guitar was playing a bit more clear, and so it didn't need much EQ at all. It's a tiny little bit of a cut out of the low and a tiny little boost to the high mid, and it brought out the clarity really nicely, and that really will fit the song really well. So once again, you might need to boost and sweeps on electric guitars during sound check, of course not during a service, in order to find out exactly if there's problem frequencies or not. Again, you want to listen to everything before you ever start EQing. You don't just start changing stuff. You might not need much EQ at all. So it's always good to be thoughtful about how you're applying it and how much. So then we want to get on to vocals. Now vocals are really important to get right with this. Different mics sometimes will pick up a bit more low end or a bit more clarity. Different voices have different textures to them, different timbres to them. And so sometimes they'll be a bit too sharp, or they might have too much low end, which might make it sound muffly. So you really want to consider, again, each vocal individually. But with most vocals, with male vocals, there is a tendency to be a bit too much low end because they're quite often very close to the mic, and that it causes a bit of proximity effect, which boosts the low end. With female vocals, quite often, if they sing in a high range, there might be a sharpness to their voice. So sometimes doing a cut in the high mids will actually get rid of some of that sharpness. And then most vocal mics will be improved by taking a very high shelf, and it basically doesn't really add clarity as much as it adds openness. And it might be hard to describe until we hear it, so I'm going to try that, and we're going to do that. So I'm going to go through first a female vocal and then a male vocal. So female vocal first, let's listen to that.
You higher, your love, your love, your love, never ending. Oh, 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 you are alive in us.
That sounds fairly clear and fairly natural how that person sounds. There's a high pass filter in just to get rid of those very lows. Again, not going to affect the way their voice sounds, but if they clap on it, it won't rumble as bad. I'll show you how it's not making much of a difference by taking it in and out, and you probably won't even notice a difference.
Nothing can take your place. You are all we need.
Actually, in this case, you probably did notice the difference because she said the word place, and there was a plosive there, puh, and it rumbled a lot more because I had the filter off. So in this case, that you can see why we put the high pass filter in, because that's the kind of benefits it has. But it didn't affect the tone of her voice at all because she wasn't singing that low in the first place. In this particular room with our mics, we almost always need
your love has set
to make small cuts in this low range. And it could very well be just a build-up of frequencies in a room or in those mics. So if I boost it, you notice how it sounds even more muffly and bizarre.
In the midst of the darkest night,
Has a really lack of clarity,
let
sort of
your
sounds
love
bizarre.
be the shining light.
If I pull a bit of it out, it
Breaking chains that were holding
sounds a lot more
me.
clear. Similar
You
thing with
sent
this
your
low
son
mid,
down to set me free.
just kind of a build up of
Everything
kind of that
this world will
boxiness in this
fade.
room.
I'm pressing on till I see your face.
If I take that out,
I will live that you will
overall it
be
just
done.
sounds more clear, more natural, more
And
full.
I won't stop till your kingdom come.
But then this high mid,
'Cause you are,
is where they're talking that sharpness on a female vocal.
freedom. We lift you higher.
If I boost
lift
it,
you higher. Your love, your love, your love, never ending. Oh, oh, oh. You are alive in us. Nothing can take.
by boosting that high mid, you get a lot more sharpness. In this case, she doesn't have an overly sharp voice, so that wasn't as exaggerated as it could be for other people, but it definitely added some sharpness when I added that. So taking a little bit out, we'll just smooth it out a little touch. Again, with making small changes, sometimes you can make a small improvement without it taking away any other part of the sound that you don't want it to do. And the last thing I want to show in this vocal is this high shelf. So basically, it's not going to make it sound overall more sharp, but overall it's more open sounding. So
Your place, you are all we need. Your love has set us free.
and if I take it
You
out,
are alive in us.
even if I'm putting it flat,
nothing can take
you notice how it doesn't
place.
sound as open as it could. It sort of sounds a bit more stuffy.
Your
by adding some of that
love
in.
has set us free. Whoa,
It just opens up the sound a little bit. And if I take it out a lot, it'll sound like it's under a blanket, basically.
whoa, whoa.
So a little boost there will always be a huge help for vocals. So for a male vocal, they quite often don't need that high mid boost, cut that is, but they might need a greater low or low mid cut. So let's listen to this male vocal.
You are my freedom.
So you notice there's a lot more low end information in that.
You are my freedom. We lift you higher, lift you higher. Your love, your love, your love, never ending. Oh, 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 you are alive in us.
So I took out a bit of that low, and the whole thing became a bit more clear sounding. It didn't rumble quite as much. It already had that low mid boost from before where we got rid of some of that stuffy sound. And it doesn't have as much of a high mid cut because he doesn't get nearly as sharp. But I'm going to do that same thing with that high shelf so you can hear how it sounds more open even for a male vocal as well. So let's listen to that. So I'm going to start by having it flat.
Nothing can
sounds okay.
take your place.
But as
You
I do
are
this boost,
all we need. Your love has set us free.
it's somewhat subtle, but as you hear it, there's definitely more openness. It definitely doesn't sound quite as closed. And if I do a big cut now, it'll sound really stuffy. So
You are alive in us. Nothing can take your place. You are all we need. Your love.
So that's one thing where it's only makes a smaller change because these mics are really only barely picking up frequencies that high in the first place. But by adding some of that in, it just helps it to sound a little bit less contained or small or too close up. So those are some really handy things for vocals. So vocals, again, are a tricky thing to 100% get right. Lots of different voices. Someone might have a really low baritone voice. You might need to pull out more low end than others. Some might be have a nasaliness. So there might be certain frequencies you can pull out to help reduce that. Other people might have very SE, so you might need to pull out some very high frequencies to get rid of some SE-ness. So these are things you're all going to have to consider as you go through each vocal individually. And again, listen to each individual sound. If you need to do, again, during a rehearsal, a boost and sweep to try to find something, you can do that. And again, analyze for yourself, how does this voice sound? If it sounds great without any EQ, awesome. But if it needs a bit of a cut, a bit of a boost, listen for why it might need those boosts and cuts, and do it accordingly. And again, usually subtlety is the key here. You don't want to overly boost anything or overly cut anything for the most part. Small cuts will make a big difference as they add up together in your whole mix. So as you add a bunch of small changes to a bunch of different sources, your whole mix will sound more professional, a bit tighter, a bit cleaner, less prone to feedback, less rumbliness, and you'll have just a more pleasing mix. And so this is something where you can, again, keep developing this skill. Keep listening for different EQ sources. Keep trying stuff at home. If let's say you have GarageBand or some software on your computer, just play with their different EQ buttons. Really try to hone your ear into what sounds like what. And this will help you in any mixing you do, especially when you mix for Church of the Rock in a live setting. So hope this was helpful to you. I hope this is going to be a chance for you to really think about what you're doing and why whenever you approach any mixing board that has any EQ knobs, and that you have the concepts in your mind so you know what to do and when, and how you might be able to enhance certain sources or take out problem frequencies. I hope this training will make you feel confident about learning to EQ different sound sources in different environments. We learned the main EQ types, their controls and their applications. We learned the boost and sweep method of trying to isolate an area that needs EQ, and we went over some of the common uses of EQ in different sound sources. And now it's a time to answer some of the questions below. Coming up next is session 8, which is our last session. We're going to go over signal processing tools that'll help you really kind of sweeten and dial in a mix. Enjoy.